Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we're going straight to the heart of American infrastructure. We're taking a massive stack of sources. We've got financial reports, crisis timelines, you name it, to really understand a company that is just absolutely foundational to modern life.
And it's one of those companies that, you often only notice when something goes wrong.
Exactly. Our mission today is a really in-depth exploration of CenterPoint Energy, Inc.
That's right. And when you look at these utility giants, especially the ones that cross multiple state lines and handle both electricity and natural gas distribution, you're looking at a logistical challenge that is, well, it's just immense.
So the goal for you, listening in, is to move beyond the headlines about outages and really grasp the scale of this thing, the complexity of its inherited systems, the strategic attempts at modernization, and crucially, the intense pressure CenterPoint faces during these major system failures.
And of course, the corporate and regulatory scrutiny that always follows.
It's basically a shortcut to understanding the economic and physical reality of managing the modern power grid.
To set the stage, we are talking about a Fortune 500 company. It's publicly traded on the NYSE. The ticker is CNP, and it's a component of the S&P 500. So this is not a small player.
Not at all. This is a critical infrastructure provider for millions of Americans across, 6, 7, 8 states.
It's a huge territory.
And this inherent scale, it immediately leads us to this critical paradox we found right at the top of the sources. Let's look at the financial snapshot from the fiscal year that ended December 31st, 2020. This data point right here really sets the stage for everything we're going to talk about today.
The figures are staggering, but they also tell a very complicated story. In 2020, CenterPoint reported total assets of U.S. $33.471 billion.
$33 billion.
Billion, with a B. And their total revenue that year was U.S. $7.412 billion.
Okay, so $33 billion in assets. Let's just pause on that for a second. What does that number even mean in the real world? It's not cash in a bank, right?
No, not at all. That represents the physical hardware. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of miles of high-tension transmission lines, substations the size of city blocks, gas pipelines running under entire states.
Metering infrastructure, the whole physical plant needed to keep the lights on and the heat flowing for this massive territory.
Exactly. It's the book value of the physical plant itself. And the sheer necessity of maintaining that enormous aging physical plant is what complicates their whole financial picture.
How so?
Well, despite that massive asset base and over $7 billion in revenue, the company reported a net loss of $773 million for that fiscal year.
Wait, a loss? A net loss of nearly $800 million.
Yeah.
How does a utility even do that? It feels like they have a guaranteed customer base, a regulated monopoly in many places.
Oh, that's the paradox. It's often a combination of factors that are pretty unique to regulated utilities. A huge portion of those assets, that $33 billion, depreciates over time. The pipes get older, the wires need replacing.
So they're constantly spending money just to stand still.
Constantly. They're always engaged in these massive capital expenditure programs to replace aging infrastructure. And depending on regulatory approval, those costs might not be immediately recoverable through the rates they charge customers.
And was 2020 a particularly bad year?
You have to remember, 2020 specifically was dominated by the economic disruption of the pandemic. You also had potential write-downs of legacy assets, and critically, the preliminary costs of preparing for or recovering from severe weather events.
Okay, so the takeaway is this. Maintaining an aging multi-state infrastructure system is just staggeringly expensive.
So expensive that those costs can easily outrun operational revenue, even with millions of customers. It paints a picture where high revenue doesn't equal easy profit. Not at all.
Especially when you're facing the pressures of aging infrastructure and, climate change. And speaking of aging, this isn't some modern tech startup. The historical foundation here is deep.
It is remarkably deep. The company traces its origins all the way back to 1882.
Wow, so that's 143 years old as of when we're talking now, late 2025?
That's right. And this vast history is exactly why their infrastructure is such a complex blend of old and new systems all stitched together.
And tracing the evolution of its names. It's like tracing the entire history of utility finance and regulatory policy in the U.S.
That's a great way to put it. You can see this whole progression. It started as Houston Industries and the famous Houston Lighting and Power, or HL&P.
a name a lot of people in Texas will still remember.
Absolutely. It then moved through phases as Norm Energy and Reliant Energy before finally settling on CenterPoint Energy. And these name changes, they aren't just rebranding. They represent massive corporate restructurings, mergers, and most importantly, the foundational regulatory upheaval that completely reshaped the industry in the early 2000s.
Especially in its home state of Texas.
Especially in Texas.
That brings us perfectly to our next section, the utility landscape. If you really want to understand CenterPoint's DNA today, you have to understand the impact of Texas deregulation.
Right. The state's move toward a competitive energy market fundamentally dictated what CenterPoint became.
So what was the thinking there? Why did Texas deregulate in the first place?
Well, the Texas deregulation around 2002-2003 was one of the most drastic in the entire nation. The goal was to split up the old integrated utilities.
The ones that did everything from, generating the power to sending you the bill?
Exactly. They wanted to split those up into separate entities to try and introduce retail competition for electricity while keeping the essential delivery infrastructure, the poles and wires, regulated.
So if HL&P was that original unified entity, what did the big split of 2003 actually produce?
It produced three distinct entities from that original structure. First, you had Reliant Energy.
Okay, and that became the retail electricity provider, the brand name you see on your bill.
That's it. They were the ones selling power directly to consumers in this new competitive marketplace. Second, you got Texas Genco.
Genco, so generation.
Precisely. This was the generation arm. It owned the massive power plants, the gas, coal, nuclear facilities that actually produced the electricity.
And the third piece?
The third piece was CenterPoint Energy, and it was established as the transmission and distribution utility, or what they call a TDU.
Let's spend a moment defining that TDU role, because CenterPoint's whole identity is wrapped up in this. It sounds like the least competitive, but maybe the most critical role in the market structure.
It absolutely is. The TDU is the regulated delivery arm. So CenterPoint doesn't generate the power, and they don't sell it directly to you.
A retail provider like Reliant does that.
Right. CenterPoint's job is to maintain and operate the poles, the wires, the substations, and the meters that deliver whatever power you choose from whatever generator it comes from.
So they're the essential, non-optional pipes and wires.
They are. And they're regulated as a monopoly for that very reason. I mean, running competing sets of wires down every street would be wildly inefficient. So their revenue is based on tariffs approved by regulators, designed to cover their costs and their investment in all that infrastructure.
And the fate of the generation arm, Texas Genco, it really shows just how lucrative and attractive that unregulated side of the business was right after the split.
Oh, it highlights the intense financial interest immediately.
Yeah.
Texas Genco, the actual power plants, was swiftly sold in late 2004 to a consortium of 4 major private equity firms.
And these were the big players, right?
The biggest. Texas Pacific Group, Blackstone Group, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, and Hellman and Friedman. That's a dream team of institutional investors recognizing the value of those generation assets.
And those firms didn't hold on to it for very long, did they?
No, just 2 years later, in 2006, they sold Texas Genco again, this time to a company called NRG Energy.
So that rapid-fire turnover from being part of a utility to private equity, then to a massive independent power producer.
It just demonstrates the immediate profitability and the financial velocity surrounding power generation assets once they were divorced from the slow, regulated pace of the distribution utility.
And CenterPoint, meanwhile, was left with the less glamorous, but I'd argue infinitely more demanding task of managing that aging physical grid.
Across vast areas. And that brings us to their expansive geographic reach. Moving beyond Texas, CenterPoint's territory today is defined by all these historical companies it acquired over the last century and a half.
So this isn't a single unified grid they built from scratch. It's, in a sense, an infrastructure Frankenstein.
That analogy of an infrastructure Frankenstein is pretty apt, actually, because they inherited not just customers, but all these disparate systems and, importantly, different regulatory frameworks. We can trace their current complexity right back to specific historical names and their service areas.
Let's look at the gas side first, which covers an immense territory. Where does that start?
You can start with Minnegasco. This is the historical name for their natural gas operations all across Minnesota.
Okay, so now think about the challenge there. Managing gas lines in the extreme deep freeze conditions of a Minnesota winter requires entirely different maintenance standards, different pressure monitoring, different crisis preparedness.
Then, say, managing gas lines in humid subtropical South Texas. It's a completely different world, technically speaking.
And they also had Entex and Arkla covering the southern and central U.S.
That's right. NTEX covered natural gas throughout South and East Texas, southern Louisiana, and Mississippi. And then ARCLA extended that natural gas footprint throughout northern Louisiana, northeast Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas.
So you're talking about a gas network covering, what, 7 states, roughly?
At least, with pipelines that were laid down at different times using different materials, under the jurisdiction of numerous state utility commissions, each with its own rate structure and its own maintenance requirements.
So if you are the CEO of CenterPoint on any given Tuesday, you are simultaneously reporting to regulators in Minnesota, Texas, Mississippi, and Arkansas, all on different gas infrastructure standards.
And you're managing the electric transmission standards for ERCOT down in Houston.
That complexity, that regulatory patchwork, and the burden of integrating aging disparate systems, that has to be the central tension of their daily operations.
It is. And they actively chose to expand this regulated footprint even further with the massive acquisition of Vectren.
Right, the Vectren merger.
Yeah.
This was a strategic move, I assume, to grow their regulated asset base, which offers more stable, predictable returns than the volatile competitive market.
Exactly. The definitive merger agreement was announced in April 2018. They acquired Vectren Corporation, which primarily served Indiana and Ohio.
So moving into the Midwest.
A big move into the Midwest. It was completed in early 2019, taking Vectren off the NYSE. This move really solidified CenterPoint's position there, bringing in a whole new set of electric and gas assets and, of course, new regulatory oversight bodies to answer to.
And they handled the branding transition pretty carefully in those new Midwest territories, as I recall.
They did. They retained the well-known Vectren name in Indiana and Ohio for over 2 years after the acquisition closed. The name was finally retired on May 3rd, 2021.
That gradual integration, I guess it helps manage customer relations and regulatory continuity.
It does. But the overall takeaway from this history is crystal clear. CenterPoint is a highly fragmented entity. It's managing dozens of regulatory relationships and vast, diverse physical plants that span from the Gulf Coast energy hubs all the way to the frigid pipelines of the upper Midwest.
Given that immense operational and regulatory complexity, let's pivot now to how CenterPoint is trying to look forward. Because despite dealing with all these historical headaches, the company has undertaken some major strategic initiatives in technology and infrastructure.
Right. When a utility faces pressure to modernize, they often turn to smart grid technology. And CenterPoint was an early mover in this space with its smart meter pilot program in Texas.
And this started a while ago, right?
Deployment started way back in March 2009.
And this wasn't just a corporate investment. It was part of a larger national push for grid modernization that followed the 2008 financial crisis.
Absolutely. The program received a very significant financial injection, $200 million from the Federal Stimulus Act.
So the government was actively funding this.
They were. And that federal funding wasn't just handed over. It required CenterPoint to demonstrate specific technical capabilities and provide verifiable data. The mission was twofold: deliver enhanced smart meter functionality and rigorously study real-world consumer energy consumption patterns.
So why was the government so keen to fund this specific technology? What's the big deal with smart meters?
The big deal is that smart meters fundamentally change the relationship between the consumer and the grid. They enable two-way communication. For the utility, it means they can instantly know when an outage occurs, which reduces truck rolls and restoration time.
And for the consumer?
For you, it means understanding exactly when and how you use energy. That allows you to participate in programs like time of use rates, shifting your laundry or dishwasher use away from expensive peak hours to save money.
And did the pilot actually prove that people would change their behavior?
It did. That was the key finding. After working with 500 residential customers in the Houston area, the pilot confirmed that smart meters successfully helped consumers cut down on energy use for the home.
So when customers had the data, they acted on it.
When they had granular data about their usage and price signals, they changed their behavior. And that validation justified the massive long-term investment in rolling out smart meters across their entire electric service territory.
Okay, so moving beyond just measuring consumption, CenterPoint also showed, I think, significant foresight by addressing the next massive strain on the grid,
Right.
the shift to electric vehicles.
This is where it gets really interesting, because the source material points to a formal partnership with Ford Motor Company way back in 2010.
2010, that is a full decade before the current EV boom
Yep.
really took off.
Right. CenterPoint recognized very early on that mass EV adoption couldn't happen without utility preparation. The grid had to be ready.
What were the specific goals of this collaboration? I mean, they weren't just talking about selling cars, they were talking about infrastructure readiness.
Exactly. They established four interconnected goals. The first was focused on education, just creating consumer outreach and education programs for EVs. People didn't know much about them then.
And the second goal.
The second was about knowledge dissemination, distributing technical details to various stakeholders, city planning departments, residential developers, other utilities, about specific residential charging needs and the impacts on the grid's load.
And the third goal speaks directly to CenterPoint's primary responsibility as that TDU.
Precisely. The third goal was critically assessing the requirements to ensure the existing electrical infrastructure could support the necessary demand.
Because if every home in a suburban neighborhood starts plugging in a car that draws as much power as an entire central AC unit,
You suddenly have these massive aggregated load spikes on the local transformer and the distribution lines. You could blow transformers all down the street. CenterPoint needed to study how to avoid overloading those lines and substations.
and the final goal connected the charging needs back to the larger environmental mandate.
Yes, the fourth goal was developing strategies to minimize emissions and distribution impacts of charging. The best way to do this is to encourage what we now call smart charging.
Meaning you charge your car at specific times.
Yeah, using statewide renewable energy and efficient household electricity use. They wanted to ensure that when you charged your EV, it happened during off-peak hours, ideally drawing power from wind or solar resources. That minimizes the burden on the grid and maximizes the environmental benefit.
It shows a holistic, systems-level approach to energy management, not just a reactive one.
It was very forward-thinking for 2010.
So we have a company with this enormous geographic footprint, a deep historical legacy, and a clear forward-looking strategy for modernization. But, no amount of planning can fully shield a utility from the devastating reality of extreme weather and aging systems under stress.
And that brings us to the core tension of the whole story, CenterPoint under pressure.
We're going to trace the history of three major events, Ike, the 2021 freeze, and Beryl, to really illustrate the escalating strain on this critical infrastructure and the resulting crisis of public confidence. Let's start with the first massive test, Hurricane Ike in September 2008.
Hurricane Ike was a definitive, destructive test of the physical infrastructure in the greater Houston area. It really demonstrated what happens when a massive storm surge and high winds hit a sprawling coastal service territory.
The numbers from Ike are still just shocking, even all these years later.
The scope of failure was devastating. CenterPoint lost electricity service for 2.1 million of its 2.26 million clients.
2.1 million, that's an outage rate of nearly 93%.
To put that into perspective, the entire system went down. For all practical purposes, it was gone. This wasn't a localized issue. It was a near-catastrophic failure of the regional delivery mechanisms.
And the restoration effort must have been monumental.
It required one of the largest restoration efforts in U.S. history just to rebuild the system, segment by segment, pole by pole.
Okay, so that sets a tragic benchmark for natural disaster response. But the next crisis, the 2021 Texas power outages, was entirely different. This was a unique system failure driven by cold, not wind.
That's right. The deep freeze of February 2021 exposed the critical systemic weakness of the Texas grid, its isolation from the rest of the country, and its failure to adequately winterize generation facilities.
So what was the trigger event?
The trigger was a massive cold weather front, which led ERCO, the grid operator for 90% of Texas, to declare a statewide power generation shortfall emergency. That happened early on February 15, 2021 at 1:55 a.m.
And what was the scale of that shortfall? How much power was missing?
The shortfall was estimated at 34,000 megawatts.
34,000. Can you put that in context for us?
Sure. 34,000 megawatts is roughly enough electricity to power between 6 and 8 million homes during normal demand.
So losing that much capacity instantly meant the grid was
seconds away from a full, uncontrolled blackout. A cascading failure that could have lasted for weeks, maybe even months.
And that's where CenterPoint, as the TDU in Houston, had to act immediately to prevent that total collapse.
Immediately. At 1:30 a.m. on February 15, just 5 minutes after ECOT's declaration, CenterPoint had to commence controlled, rotating outages in the greater Houston area. This is a desperate measure. It's called shedding load to balance supply and demand and save the entire system.
But the immediate messaging was, let's say, optimistic, and the reality was far harsher. and that generated immense public anger.
That messaging disconnect was so critical. The initial communication suggested the outages would be short, lasting 10 to 45 minutes, allowing customers to cycle power.
Which people can handle.
Right. But the crisis deepened so fast. The generation shortfall just kept growing as more plants froze. So CenterPoint quickly had to update its communication, warning customers to be prepared to be without power for the rest of Monday.
That shift from 45 minutes to possibly days is what fueled the panic.
A genuine sense of panic and helplessness across the entire city in freezing temperatures.
Yes. And adding to this complexity was CenterPoint's dual role as a gas provider. The crisis wasn't just electric in Texas. It became a natural gas supply crisis, and that affected their entire 8-state footprint.
This highlights that infrastructure Frankenstein we talked about earlier. CenterPoint had to instruct customers across its entire service territory, including its natural gas customers in Minnesota, Louisiana, and Arkansas, inherited from Minigasco and Arkla, to voluntarily lower their thermostat settings.
Why? Why would a Texas electricity problem affect a gas customer in Minnesota?
Because the gas supply system is interconnected. While Texas was the focal point, the demand spike for gas across the country to power generation facilities and heat homes put enormous pressure on the pipelines that feed CenterPoint's distribution networks everywhere. The Texas electricity crisis cascaded into a national gas conservation effort.
And the operational chaos just continued through the night and into Tuesday morning.
The situation remained incredibly fragile. CenterPoint tried to restart the process of rolling outages early Tuesday morning, but the system stability was just too poor. They had to stop again around 4 a.m. because of another emergency ERCOT order.
What happened?
Several third-party electric generators, the former Texas Genco assets, tripped offline due to the extreme cold. They just couldn't handle it. They couldn't safely restart the rolling outages until around 1:40 in the afternoon that day.
The system was that brittle. Just the act of restoring power in one area risked causing a total blackout for everyone else.
It was that close to the edge.
But despite all that chaos, the restoration efforts were ultimately successful by the end of that week.
They were. By Thursday evening and Friday morning, ERCOT finally ended the emergency conditions. CenterPoint reported service restoration to about 1.39 million customers, with only a small residual number of fewer than 7,000 waiting for service. The sheer size of the restoration effort was monumental.
But the crisis still left this indelible mark on the public consciousness about utility preparedness.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the most recent crisis, Hurricane Beryl in July 2024, which seems to confirm this disturbing trend of escalating infrastructure strain.
It does. Despite all the lessons supposedly learned from Ike and the 2021 freeze, Hurricane Beryl, which was just a Category 1 storm, delivered an unprecedented blow.
When it made landfall on July 8, 2024, it caused 2.2 million CenterPoint customers to lose power.
2.2 million.
The significance of that figure just can't be overstated. That number is the largest in the company's entire 140-plus year history, surpassing Ike's 2.1 million. And it was the largest number of outages in the state's history overall.
For those of us who follow infrastructure, the fact that a Cat 1 storm, Beryl, surpassed the outage numbers of a much stronger storm like Ike from 16 years prior it's not just the statistic, it's a profound statement about the challenge of resilience investment.
What does it say?
It says that despite massive spending, the increase in infrastructure hardening has not kept pace with the increasing severity of weather events and the growth of the region.
And this time, the public anger wasn't just expressed through phone calls or angry tweets. It became a visible, tangible symbol of frustration.
That's the powerful moment of public accountability. The sources detail the emergence of this graffiti mural on an I-10 West underpass near Studwood Street. It was quickly dubbed CenterPointle.
Right, with the dollar signs for the S's.
Exactly. And this wasn't just random vandalism. It was targeted political expression, explicitly criticizing the company's lack of preparations and failure to give reliable information.
It perfectly crystallized that feeling that the utility was failing in its core duty. Not just because the lights went out, but because the preparation and the communication were perceived as completely inadequate.
And that symbol of public dissent was pretty short-lived. The Texas Department of Transportation removed the mural quickly on the following Friday.
Of course.
But the image, it perfectly illustrates the breakdown of the social contract between the regulated monopoly, which we all depend on, and the public it serves. CenterPoint, despite all its modernization efforts, remains constantly caught between the demands of infrastructure maintenance, the reality of extreme weather, and the fury of millions of powerless customers.
So we've established these intense physical and environmental pressures facing CenterPoint. Now let's shift our gaze to the corporate accountability side of things, examining the financial, regulatory, and political scrutiny the company has faced, which often runs parallel to its infrastructure challenges.
This is a critical pivot because it moves the discussion from the poles and wires to the balance sheets and the lobbying efforts. And the source material provides some very specific examples of financial missteps and political engagement that have drawn intense scrutiny. We can start back in 2005 with a significant financial reporting issue.
CenterPoint announced on December 16, 2005, that it would have to restate its finances for all of 2004 and the first 3 quarters of 2005. For a publicly traded company, especially a supposedly stable utility, a restatement is a massive red flag for investors.
It is. It signals a crisis of internal financial control and auditing integrity. The company cited the need to correct accounting errors that had overstated 2 specific categories: revenue and natural gas expenses.
Okay, so overstating revenue, I get that. It makes the company look better to investors. But overstating natural gas expenses seems counterintuitive. What does correcting both of those suggest about their financial systems at the time?
Well, it suggests significant issues in how they were tracking commodity costs and customer billing. It was possibly linked to the complexity following that deregulation split and the rapid integration of all those acquired natural gas companies like Entex and Arkla.
It sounds like a mess.
It was. And a financial restatement like that not only costs millions in auditing fees and legal expenses, but it also damages market trust, which is crucial for a company that relies so heavily on stable access to capital for all those infrastructure upgrades.
And that scrutiny over financial integrity and corporate behavior was magnified significantly by a later analysis that examined CenterPoint's tax contributions versus its profits and its political spending.
Right. We need to impartially examine the figures that were reported by the nonpartisan organization Public Campaign. This
Yeah.
report came out in December 2011, and it covered the 3-year period from 2008 to 2010.
And the analysis provides a very stark juxtaposition of corporate financial health and public contribution.
It does. Let's walk through those data points, starting with profitability and political investment. Over that 2008 to 2010 period, CenterPoint reported significant profits totaling $1.9 billion.
$1.9 billion. During that same time frame, the company spent $2.65 million on lobbying activities.
Which is pretty typical for a major utility. They constantly need to influence regulatory bodies and state legislatures regarding rate cases, infrastructure planning rules, and, disaster cost recovery.
So $1.9 billion in profits, millions spent to secure favorable regulatory outcomes. Now, for the big question. What did they pay in federal corporate income taxes during that same period?
According to the source, the company paid $0 in federal taxes.
Zero.
Zero. And beyond paying zero, they actually received tax rebates totaling $284 million.
That is the core tension point that just fuels public and political debate, isn't it? A company that is essential for modern life, that is guaranteed a customer base, that is profitable, is leveraging tax codes and lobbying efforts to pay no taxes and receive hundreds of millions back from the government.
And the source material highlights this as a legal leveraging of the tax code. It's not illegal. It's primarily through mechanisms like depreciation deductions on that massive $33 billion asset base and the utilization of other corporate tax credits available to companies investing in infrastructure.
But the optics are impossible to ignore.
Impossible. Record outages are happening against the backdrop of record tax minimization.
And the final layer of context in that public campaign report relates to the executive compensation during that time frame.
Right. While the company was reporting nearly $2 billion in profits, maximizing tax benefits, and recovering from the devastation of Hurricane Ike, the top 5 executives received substantial compensation, totaling between $12 and $13 million for that 2008 to 2010 period.
The combination of high executive compensation, nearly $2 billion in profit, 0 taxes paid, and hundreds of millions in tax rebates, all for a utility struggling to maintain reliable service. It raises these fundamental questions for the listener about the alignment of incentives.
It absolutely does. The financial figures force us to ask, if the system allows for this massive corporate financial success and aggressive tax minimization, is the existing regulatory structure incentivizing the right kind of investment? That investment needs to be focused on long-term resilience, which is often extremely expensive, doesn't provide immediate returns, and might require higher customer rates.
Which state regulators are often very reluctant to approve.
Exactly. And this systemic pressure, this conflict between shareholder expectation and infrastructure reality, That is the single greatest challenge CenterPoint faces.
This deep dive into CenterPoint Energy has really been a journey through the fundamental complexity of modern American utilities. It's impossible to walk away without a profound appreciation for the scale and all these competing forces at play.
CenterPoint really does serve as a perfect microcosm of U.S. infrastructure challenges. We've seen a company dealing with intense regulatory complexity stemming from the Texas deregulation and managing a vast, diverse geographic service territory, inheriting systems from predecessor companies like Minigasco and Arkla across multiple state jurisdictions.
They attempted to modernize, using federal funding for smart meters and showing really immense foresight with partnerships like that 2010 Ford EV collaboration, preparing for the future of the grid.
But those efforts are just overshadowed by the consequences of infrastructure vulnerability. It's highlighted by those three escalating crises: Hurricane Ike in 2008, the cascading chaos of the 2021 deep freeze, and the record-breaking 2.2 million outages during Hurricane Beryl in 2024.
Which generated that highly visible and very pointed public backlash, like the CenterPointle graffiti.
And this operational strain is all set against a backdrop of intense financial scrutiny. From the 2005 restatement of revenue and expenses to those politically charged figures from 2008-2010. The $1.9 billion in profits, the millions spent on lobbying, and zero taxes paid while receiving nearly $300 million in tax rebates.
The immense challenge for CenterPoint, and really for every utility provider, is maintaining that infrastructure reliability across these vast, diverse areas while simultaneously satisfying shareholder financial demands and navigating the political landscape that dictates their rates and their required capital expenditures.
It's an incredibly difficult balancing act.
So what does this all mean for you, the consumer, and the informed citizen? We want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. If the current political and economic system ensures that major utilities are financially incentivized, legally and strategically, to spend millions on lobbying and receive hundreds of millions in tax rebates, all while simultaneously struggling to prevent and recover from record-breaking outages and facing immense public anger, then what systemic forces need to fundamentally shift in terms of regulation, taxation, and investment mandates to truly align corporate financial health with the necessary, reliable delivery of fundamental, life-sustaining customer service?
That tension right there sits at the heart of the utility business model today, and it's something you should continue to explore as you watch the next storm approach the coast.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.